Hey, how we doing out there, guys? So, we're going to talk tonight a little bit about. We're going to kind of talk about ammo selection and judging ammo, but I'm going to come at it from a different direction than probably a lot of you are accustomed to. We're going to use something called power factor. So, guys who reload, guys who shoot competitions, you're probably familiar, or you should be familiar with power factor, especially if you shoot majors. Most, I don't know if most, but all the level 3 matches, the area matches and above that you go to will have a chronograph, so you have to have your ammo weighed and shot to make sure that you meet certain minimum standards. And probably for me, about half of the level 2, so half of the state like section level matches have that. So the kind of the reason I wanted to talk about this is, there's a lot of good information out there available now, and I'm going to bring some of it up on the screen. As far as testing data for ammunition, but I think one thing that gets lost within that is, people get, they want to see, penetration standards, the 4 layer denim test, FBI penetration in standard, 10% ballistics gel, which is obviously like the gold standard of testing. Don't get me wrong, it's very good. But then once they have that, and once they find, a particular round that is reliable or feeds reliably in the gun and things like that, people will kind of, they'll gloss over or they'll completely ignore some of the physical realities of certain rounds, i.e. the bullet weight and the muzzle velocity, and just what that does to the gun, and how it affects how the gun behaves in the hand. Because having a very controllable gun, and and a gun that gets back on target quickly but is otherwise manageable, is obviously incredibly important. Also with that, like, we have to have a gun that has significant enough power to, obviously, we need to have the projectile that hits with enough force to obtain the penetration standards and certain levels of expansion depending on the type of projectile that we're using. It also has to cycle the gun reliably, especially in carry guns. In competition guns, guys are going to do a lot more changing of springs and modifications and things like that. But you're also talking about a gun that's typically going to be very well lubed, very clean for matches. It's going to be very tuned to what it's doing. Whereas, like, obviously our carry guns, duty gear, things like that, they tend to be a little bit more mistreated, and for obvious reasons. Like, we can't really clean a gun every single day when you get, off duty or home from work or whatever. Frankly, it would be kind of a misallocation of your time and resources. So, so guys who are listening, I've kind of got myself a little PowerPoint pulled up here because I was feeling awfully froggy and fancy when I kind of came up with this topic, earlier today. So kind of flash ahead here. So what is power factor? So power factor is something that we use in USPSA, or in competition shooting, to basically determine whether or not the rounds, the ammunition that you're using meets a certain minimum standard for obvious reasons. Like, one, some of it is safety. If you have a round that is way overpowered, it's liable to blow up a gun. Or if you have a round that's way underpowered, you're liable to get squibs, in which case then blowing up the gun on a follow-up round is certainly possible. But also, we don't want somebody out there with a gun that has ammunition that just barely cycles the slide and everything like that and gives them an unfair competitive advantage. But it also means that they're going to have poor performance against steel and other types of targets. That's going to mess with the flow and the general the general ability of the match. And also, designating a minimum power factor standard gives the stage designers, the match directors, the range masters, and all that something to set the steel or the other falling targets up to. So, for example, we use a minimum power factor in USPSA of 125 for minor power factor. So that is the bare minimum power factor. And then if you shoot a division that allows major power factor, it's 165. So what that means is, so when we're setting up a stage that has steel targets, very typical stuff like that, is the guy designing the stage and the match director will set it up so that if you shoot it with a minimum power factor round from the spot where it's designed to be shot from, it will fall. And if it doesn't, then they adjust the steel during the setup process. So that gives them, kind of a sort of a hard data point to go off of that. So power factor, very simply, is the bullet weight in grains times the bullet velocity in feet per second and divided by 1,000. So an example here would be like this would be a standard factory training round that you would buy. 115 grain bullet, coming out at, a nominal 1,150 feet per second divided by 1,000 gives you a power factor of 132.25. So 132 power factor. So typically that would be, at least as it's listed on the box, that would be very typical of like your Tula, steel case 9mm 115, your Federal aluminum case, American Eagle, those sort of things. They all list 1150 typically as their designated, velocity. Now, obviously, that assumes that you're using the barrel length and stuff that they did when they did the testing. But that gives you a rough starting point to kind of know, and then obviously you have to test it on a chronograph to know for certain. So we'll kind of flash ahead here. So obviously and I'm going to use 9mm as my main examples here because it's obviously by far the most popular cartridge, and it's the one I have the most experience with reloading. And I guess I probably should state up front is like, I'm certainly a competent reloader, but I'm definitely still a guy in my circle of friends who asks a lot of questions and is not. I am not the reloading expert, so I guess maybe take some of those things with a bit of a grain of salt on there. So, couple performance related things when it comes to bullets. So what I put here, so a lighter bullet going faster, what you tend to have is a snappier muzzle, which means that the muzzle is going to move more violently, back and up. But then you very typically get a faster return to target. And then a heavy, slower bullet, so you get less snap and more push. So usually what we say, light versus heavy in like 9mm is snap versus push. So a lighter bullet that's loaded faster, because obviously it has to be to make power factor, typically the muzzle feels snappier, but the guys that like it, they like that because they tend to say that it feels like the muzzle returns very quickly to the target. Whereas heavier and slower, like I shoot 147 grains loaded reasonably slow, it can feel sluggish comparatively. It feels more manageable, and the gun doesn't feel quite as violent in your hand, but there can be like noticeable times when it feels like the gun is just like it is just not returning to target, as fast as you want it to. And now some of these, and I don't say this in like an arrogant way, like some of these are problems for people when they get to a very substantial level of skill and experience. If you're a reasonably new shooter or someone, who does kind of a very average amount of practice, you're going to notice a difference in like, how one round feels versus another, but you're probably not going to be very tuned into like, hey, this feels like it gets back on target faster or not. And so then at the bottom I kind of put, so within competition circles, which is obviously where we get like, the lion's share and we have the best data available. Typically the guys that shoot metal guns, so your CZ Shadow 2s, your Tanfolios, things like that, they like a light bullet loaded faster because it feels more manageable and it feels like it gets back to target quicker. Heavier bullets loaded more slowly are typically preferred by the guys that shoot polymer framed guns. So guys like, I shoot a CZ P10. So people who shoot, your Glocks, your CZ P10s, your SIG 320s, X5s, like all those sort of things. Your typical like polymer striker fire gun, typically heavier bullets loaded slower feels much better in those guns. And part of it is because they tend to just be lighter overall. So they're going to be a little bit more, kind of susceptible to felt recoil, felt snap on that. So here I listed, this would be, so if we're going to make what we consider a safe power factor. So obviously, so minimum power factor is 125. Typically, you want to shoot for like 132 is kind of a minimum. Like 135 is a good power factor. That gives you a little bit of a buffer because, if you have a cold muzzle versus a hot muzzle, or sometimes you go to certain matches and the chrono just is weird. And guys who shot a lot of matches and have done chrono a lot of times, can attest to that, which is that like, you never seem to have like a quote unquote standard. Like certain chronos are good, certain chronos are not good. Some matches the chrono is so messed up where they will just literally throw out all the chrono and not count it, because the data is just so unusable. But so I listed, given what, are within 9mm, the 4 standard bullet weights that people typically, fire that also corresponds with, duty or defensive, carry ammo. So if you have a 115 grain round, you're typically looking in the 1150 to 1200 feet per second. 124 grain, 1064 to 1100. 135s, 980 to 1000. 1000's easy math on that. 147s, which is what I shoot, you're usually loaded in the 900 to the 920 feet per second range. So like I said, that gives you a power factor between 132 and 135. So it'd be a safe power factor. And this is also going to correspond with, the data I'll show here in a second when we're looking up, defensive ammo, carry ammo, things like that, and why we want to use it. So kind of knowing that, a typical round performance for training ammo, competition ammo is going to come in, a power factor of 132 to 135. Now we'll flash over to, so if you guys haven't looked it up yet, so Lucky Gunner did a whole like mess of ballistics testing. I think they did it like a couple years ago was when they did the majority of it. But I'm gonna flash to it. So if you guys are watching on YouTube or if you're listening to my podcast, I suggest you go to my YouTube channel and see the video of the podcast because I've got the link there. And it is bar none the best site that I've seen with, as far as access to really substantial data. So it lists, it's got all the calibers you could possibly want to see, that people might carry. And then, for that given caliber, it lists, the bullet or the actual round itself. So it says, it's a Winchester Ranger, 124 grain plus P, whatever it happens to be. It'll show you then pictures of what the rounds look like in ballistics gel. It'll show you what the rounds look like unfired and what the rounds look like fired. It'll give you penetration data. How far did it penetrate round to round? It'll give you expansion data and it'll give you velocity data. So what we can glean from this, I'm going to flash over to this, to Lucky Gunner here. So we're going to go to my 9mm stuff here. So this is, and kind of this was the whole point of what I wanted to make the video is, so obviously we need a round that is reliable in the gun. We need a round that meets the, standard FBI penetration standards of, 4-layer denim, 12 to 18 inches of penetration in 10% ballistics gel. And then within that, we also need a round where we don't want the average penetration performance. We do want the average, but we also want the mode and the median. So what we don't want to see, so guys who are, watching this, on YouTube, you can kind of look at stuff like, this Corbon 80 grain Glazer slug. So the Glazer slug is meant to be a very low penetrating, like safety slug. So one of the rounds penetrated to like 16, 17 inches, and then the other 4 were all like 5 to 6, and then even some of the other rounds you get down to like Federal 147 grain HST, kind of a little bit all over the board. So you want something that's like very reliable. So you look at this like Corbon 115 grain jacket hollow point, like all the rounds very tightly clustered penetration wise. So that's what we're looking for reliability wise. So once we find given rounds that meet the standards that we need as far as actual performance, then what I like to do and what I think something like power factor is really useful is I like to kind of go over and look at my, muzzle velocities relative to the bullet, the actual projectile weight, and kind of get an idea of what that round's going to feel like when I shoot it. So obviously, so kind of when I flashed back, to my previous screen there, talking to some of our standard velocities for given rounds. So our 115s are going to be 1150 to 1200. We're going to be like 1064 to 1100 for our 124s. Our 135s are going to be like 980 to 1000, and then 147s are going to be, 900 to 920. So this is one thing, and this is one thing I always use, like if someone's like, talking on the internet, like I used to shoot 40 cal when I shot limited division, and, guys would comment on my videos, or they would be on videos, they'd be like, oh, I'm a super expert in this and that, because I carry a 40, and the 40 is the best round ever. I carry a 180 grain, projectile loaded to 1200 feet per second. It just has so much knockdown power. And like the instant I hear that, I know that this person's a moron, but also I know that they never shoot ever, because anyone who shot 40 cal in limited, if you shot a 180 grain projectile loaded to 1200 feet per second, that would be a freaking nuclear bomb in your hand, especially with a carry gun. Like it would be so unbelievably terrible to shoot that 5 or 10 rounds at the range and you'd be like, dude, I don't want to do this anymore. So that's kind of one of the things I can kind of use it for. And then I'll also look through other things and see like, hey, does this look like a round that's going to be kind of on the, on the manageable standard? So, for example, come over to like, an industry standard. So, Federal 124 grain HST is one of like the 2 or 3 rounds that are like the absolute gold standard. That and the like the Spirit Gold Dot, the absolute gold standard of carry ammo, duty ammo, whatever. So you look at standard Federal 124 grain HST. Average penetration of 18.3, super well clustered, extremely good, expansion, performance. So above 50% expansion, coming in at 1135 feet per second. So 1135, with 124 grain, that's going to be a little snappy. And I carry HST. It's one of the 2 carry rounds that I have for my 9 mils. So we talk about 1135. As far as velocity, that's going to give us 140 power factor. So that's, we can already tell that's going to be a little snappy when we shoot it. It's a lighter bullet. It's going faster, so we know we get more snap versus push. But then also this is starting to get a little bit beyond what we said, like we wanted to be kind of like in the 1100 range, for our 124 stuff sort of at the top. So like, okay, that's going to be, we're going to start to get a little snappy for 1135. So, okay, now we come down to Federal 124 grain HST plus P. So you guys know the people, that I know, and some people, they get really hung up on like, oh, it's got to be plus P. Well, so, okay, so when we look at like the testing data and stuff, very comparable, essentially the same performance as the standard HST. But now you get over to 1168, feet per second on the velocity. So we had, 140 power factor with our 1135 with standard HST. So now let's say we go to that 1168. So now you're talking 144 power factor. Like that Federal HST plus P out of the standard, 4-inch, 4.5-inch barrel, 9mm, carrier duty gun is going to be very, very snappy. It is going to be an unpleasant gun to shoot. So yes, you get good performance from the round, but one look at that using the data and like, okay, bam, I know for a fact this is going to be unpleasant, unpleasant to shoot. So these are things, it's very useful, kind of keep in mind. We'll kind of float down the chart here again because there's a couple other ones that sort of stood out to me. Like I said, I shoot 147s in my, for all my training ammo, competition ammo, and stuff like that. So Federal 147 grain HST is another like standard round. So this one's coming in at 973. So I can already tell like, hey, standard 147, that's going to be a little snappy. Probably, not like awful, but it's going to be a little snappy, 143 power factor. So I see that, and like this is specific reason why I do not carry the 147 grain HSTs is because of this. But now let's look down at the Federal 147 grain HST plus P. So a 1008 average velocity with 147s, you mean 148, 149 power factor. That is going to be a very awful round to shoot. Like you are not going to want to shoot a lot of that. So me personally, this is why I carry 124 grain HSTs, for the 124 grain stuff that I do use. It's just strictly because of that. One look at it, I'm like, all right, I know that thing's going to be snappy. Come down to some other stuff here. So Hornady Critical Duty is another very well respected round. It's one of those that I would say, is among the three rounds that are kind of considered the gold standard. Hornady Critical Duty, Federal HST, Spear Gold Dot, those are considered, very gold standard, as far as performance. So while you do get good performance, let's take a look at the Critical Duty plus P here. So 135 grain round, and then you're talking 1118 feet per second. So you're going to talk, that's 151 power factor. So I know for a fact, without ever shooting it, I look at that Hornady, 135 grain Critical Duty plus P, and I'm like, dude, I want nothing to do with that, right? Even the 135 grain regular Critical Duty is, 1,053 feet per second. So again, these are just like things that I think are very useful. When additionally, like when it comes to picking, some of your ammunition. Like obviously, I need something that performs well, but like I don't buy the argument that like, oh, under stress you're not going to feel the recoil of this or that, and I don't buy that because either the recoil and the movement of the muzzle is there or it isn't, right? So even if I'm not necessarily aware of it, it is absolutely still affecting my performance because that muzzle is coming up and off target, shot to shot. So these are things to these are absolutely things to keep in mind, and this is why I think again this the Lucky Gunner site is bar none the best site for information, and it's fantastic. I go here all the time and just in my brain, I just download information, just things that I find to be useful, and squirrel that away for stuff that I might stuff that I might need it for. And so again, that's kind of how we can use our power factor for that. As far as just kind of getting a decent feel for what I think the behavior of the gun is going to be when I shoot that. So again, I need a round that's reliable, need a round that penetrates to standard, that has acceptable expansion, especially if it's a 9mm or if it's a round that's meant to expand. Obviously, if I'm shooting a wad cutter or something, it's not meant to expand. Okay, I don't need expansion out of that. But then I want something that's manageable and something that's gonna help keep me at my skill level shooting it and not depress my own abilities because of how how snappy and how how recoil heavy it is. So we'll kind of flash ahead here. So kind of One of the last sort of things to consider with this is kind of bullet profile. So here I put a few different 9mm rounds, and I put one of my 22 mag rounds next to it, just because I do carry a 22 mag revolver quite a lot. So going from left to right, so on the left, that's an Federal 124 grain HST. The one next to it is a Hornady 115 grain. One second, let me grab my box. Okay. So the one next to it is the Federal. It's the 115 grain FTX critical defense. So it's kind of so it's meant a little bit more for shorter barreled guns. Next to that is a 147 grain flat nose. That's a black bullet, so loaded one of my training rounds. Next to that is a 147 grain blue bullet round nose. Next to that is your standard Federal aluminum case 115 grain full metal jacket. And then next to that is a Spear Gold Dot 40 grain 22 mag. So a little bit about bullet profile. So like we said, most of your good, well-manufactured carry guns, Glock, CZs, SIGs, Walther, HK, whatever else, things like that. Your Smith & Wesson M&P. Most of those are going to have no problems with all of your standard rounds. But one thing to keep in mind, and so the reason that I have, so that round there, that's second from the left, the Hornady Critical Defense FTX 115 grain, is it's a much more tapered round, and my CZ-P10C, so the compact, so the Glock 19 size CZ, it has in the past had some issues feeding my flat nose, my flat point practice ammo, and a few of my duty or my carry rounds. So usually I try to replace all my carry ammo once a year. So when I get to the end of the year, I just go out and when I'm doing a training session, I shoot all of my carry ammo in my regular drills and then replace it. And because it's a compact gun, everything has to happen a little bit quicker than your full-size guns as far as the recoil of the slide and all that relative to the amount of spring tension and all those other things. So I've noticed that my CZ-P10 can be a little susceptible to flat points not feeding up the feed ramp. So I got a round that's a little bit more tapered, but if I flash back to the Lucky Gunner stuff, it meets all of my necessary standards for penetration expansion, and it's reliable in my gun. So I carry that in my CZ-P10. I still have a lot of Barnes 115 grain XPD and Federal HST, and I carry that if I have a full-size CZ on a duty gig, or I carry like a full-size Glock 17 a fair amount on duty gigs, and then I'll have my HST stuff in there with no worries whatsoever. And then obviously the other 3 rounds represent training ammunition. So that's just something else to kind of keep in mind there, which is that your round nose bullets are typically the most reliable because obviously they're very highly tapered, which means that they're going to be they're going to make usage of the feed ramp a lot more efficiently than shorter, stubbier projectiles are. In full-size guns, it usually doesn't matter at all. Like my full-size CZs, I've shot tens of thousands of 147 grain flat points, no problems whatsoever. But my smaller guns, sometimes those do have issues, with some of that stuff. And then kind of the last thing that I wanted to sort of talk about with ammunition stuff, because I think this is something that most other people don't talk about when I talk about the ammunition stuff here. So I want to talk about the concept or the idea of sacrificing ballistics or ballistic performance for shooting performance. And so kind of the specific example I'm going to use with this is anybody who sees my stuff on Instagram or, sees some of the things I post knows that my leaving the gym, going to jiu-jitsu, leaving jiu-jitsu, or my otherwise need to carry a gun with me, but am not in a position to carry a quote unquote legit gun, is I carry a Smith & Wesson 351C revolver, which is a snub-nosed J-frame. It's a 7-round 22 mag revolver. And frankly, I freaking love that thing. Fully loaded, it weighs 12.1 ounces. It's ridiculous how small that thing is. But what kind of has shocked some people when I told them is, so I had a Smith & Wesson, I think it was a 442 or 642. Someone out there will correct me. So whatever the J-frame 5-round 38 special is, that was the blued and not the stainless. That's the one I had. I think it's the 442. And so I actually sold that to a friend of mine who wanted a 38 snub and then bought a 22 mag. So I took I downgraded in ballistics to get the 22 mag. And so I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but something, in consideration, especially when you start talking about carrying smaller and smaller guns and pocket guns. So, we kind of live in a realm where the really popular carry guns now are like the SIG 365, the Glock 43, Smith & Wesson Shield, the SIG, the 938s, the 238s. Otherwise, like very small guns, and obviously like snub nose revolvers are still a very popular, gun across the various different communities when it comes to that. So one thing that we kind of have to keep in mind is that as the guns get smaller and easier to conceal, all of their ballistic performance decreases, and all of the inherent problems of a semi-automatic magazine-fed pistol get exacerbated. When we talk about not having a good grip and getting limp wrist related failures, those instances go up as the gun gets smaller because it's harder to get a good grip, especially if you're under stress, or drawn from concealment, drawn from a pocket holster, things like that. And they're less forgiving, when it comes to just pure cycling stuff. It also means that they're not achieving particularly good velocities. So a lot of the, subcompact, and micro-sized guns, they don't really elicit much or any reliable expansion of like typical 9mm rounds and things. So there's a fair amount of those guns, and I'm not really going to get into which ones, but there's a fair amount of those where like a lot of people still, they kind of recommend carrying a solid projectile for certain subcompact micro guns, just because you're basically betting that the chances of you getting expansion with the very low velocities that come from really small barrels is low enough that you might as well just carry a dedicated solid projectile. That way you can at least achieve your necessary penetration standards, your 12 to 18 inches, 4-layer denim FBI standard when it comes to that, and just not really worry about trying to, eke out a little expansion, here and there. But also, and like I said, with my guns, is that, those rounds, like your typical jacketed hollow points and some of those that are, they're a little bit more of a flat nose profile, they can give you problems in those, in the smaller guns. And so then kind of to my own example, my own point is, so the 38 Special, it's definitely ballistically superior to a 22 Magnum. Don't get me wrong, especially with semi-wad cutters out of the snub nose. It has better penetration values, or at least very comparable penetration values, and it does have better expansion-related potential for various carry rounds with that. However, kind of on the flip side, is anyone who's shot snub nose revolvers knows that even a 38 snub nose is very snappy. It's very uncomfortable to shoot. It is not pleasant to train with at all. So most people don't train very much with snub nose revolvers. Guys who do have just, their round count's still very typically low, but they've kind of just, resigned themselves to hey, this sucks. And so a 50-round practice session with a snub nose 38 is a lot of, rounds to fire in a practice session. Whereas conversely, I switched to 22 Magnum. And again, I'm not saying that this is a correct choice. I'm just saying that there are additional reasons. So the 38 is superior ballistically. Of that, there is no question. And realistically, you could say it's a more reliable cartridge because it's a center fire pistol cartridge, whereas the 22 Magnum is a rim fire. But the 22 Magnum is incredibly pleasant to shoot. Spear, Gold Dot, Hornady, Critical Duty or Critical Defense, and Federal Punch all offer dedicated short-barreled defensive rounds for them now that do meet, standard FBI 4-layer denim and 10% ballistics gel penetration standards, and do offer pretty reasonable prospects of 20 to 50% expansion on that. But the 22 Magnum is very pleasant to shoot. Anyone who follows my Instagram channel, I usually shoot that at the end of all my training sessions on Fridays and Sundays. And I'll shoot 20 or 30 rounds through it, and it's legitimately enjoyable. Not only is it can I gut my way through it, but it's legitimately enjoyable. So my physical performance with that firearm is much superior to my physical performance with my 38 snub nose. Ballistically, it's not as good, but my performance as a shooter is much better. One, I gain 2 more rounds, so I have 40% better capacity. But now it's a round that, one, I practice with more, so I'm just much more familiar with it. It's not nearly as snappy. It doesn't have as heavy of recoil. It's very easy to use and get multiple hits on target rapidly, at any sort of standard distances. And I've shot it, all the way out to and including, I shot the flavor of the week, the Dickens drill there a few weeks ago at 40 yards with my snub nose. I didn't shoot 10 rounds. I just, unloaded a 7-round cylinder, and that is doable performance, out to 40 yards, and within, that particular drill's 15-second, time frame of getting a preponderance of alphas out of those 7 rounds is very doable. So the performance of the 22 mag in this particular example, it punches a little bit above its weight, and it's very pleasant to shoot. So I am a better shooter performance-wise with it at the sacrifice of ballistics. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to especially carrying like subcompacts and micro guns. While the 380 is not the cartridge that 9mm is in standard, like duty size or even compact, so 4-inch, 4.5-inch barrel guns, you start talking about micro guns, and I don't know if this is true. I'm just kind of a metaphor, but like if you have a cartridge that you physically can perform better with and still is reliable, functions well in the gun, when you're talking about these guns that are so small, and compact and relatively hard to use, that's something worth considering, in the Switch versus being kind of stuck on things. And, kind of the last point that I'll make with that before I, kind of shut down here is I've brought this up. It's come up in other groups that I've talked about in other conversations of, something like, let's say like a 22 long rifle. So the 22 long rifle, like nobody's going to look at it and go, man, that's a man stopper. Like that hits you and just blows the doors off or anything like that. But the 22 out of, I forget the model. I think it's, what is it, 341 or something, Smith & Wesson, the 8-shot, revolver. And then Ruger has an LCR, I think, in 22 long rifle as well. The 22 long rifle, it does, there are multiple rounds that meet minimum FBI penetration standards. It certainly is not the wound causer that, that a 38 or 357 9mm 40 cal is. Like, there's no question about that. But there's, there comes a thing that you have to ask yourself, which is one, for me, like my snub nose is a roll gun. Given the chance or given the opportunity, obviously I carry my standard 9mm 15-round gun, dot on the top, it's got a light, all that sort of stuff. And if you were to say, hey Lane, when you step outside of your house here in 10 minutes, you're going to get in a gunfight and you only get to carry one pistol. Obviously, I'm not grabbing my 7-round, 22 mag snub nose. But one, when we can be in, very like, deep concealment, non-permissive environments, and also just the fact that like one thing I bring up to a lot of people is like, man, like carrying a gun should not dictate your whole life. Like your life should dictate your gun to a very large extent. And what I mean by that is we need to carry like a good, reliable, gun. However, like you should still be able to go to the beach and mow your lawn and, move around the house and go play with your kids and, go watch, football games on Friday night or whatever without being burdened by the fact that like I have a fairly like, a Glock 19, like a loaded Glock 19 with a dot and a light is not a small or particularly light gun relative to, other things I might have on my belt or in my pants to go out and do normal life. So that's something to keep in mind with that. And then the other side of that is when we start thinking about, and I've been unbelievably guilty of this in the past, especially with like, like past girlfriends or like my mother, sister, things like that, is, I was always like, well, 9mm is the standard. If you have a handgun, it has to be 9mm. And 9mm is the single best pistol round. Of that, there's no question. But take my mother, mid-60s, arthritis in the hands, things like that. So if I was going to, talk with her about self-defense, having a weapon at home for defense, one, if I give her a full-size 9mm, she can't use it, and she's not going to. It's not comfortable. She can't get her hands around it. So it's not going to get used ever. If I gave her, let's say, like a 22 long rifle revolver, she probably couldn't work the trigger because, the J-frame, revolvers, I mean, you're talking 12 or 14 pound, trigger pull. But something to consider might be, like, what if I get her a Ruger 1022 and I could get it with a very shortened stock, or I could cut the stock off, something with just a pistol grip. I could get her a 25-round magazine. Is a 22 long rifle going to blow the doors off of anyone who, may come into the house or may come onto the property? It's certainly not. But given the option that either A, we know she can't use any of the full-size standard 9mm stuff, so her option is either A, to punch somebody or to stab somebody, or it could give her this 22, which is basically stabbing screwdriver size holes in someone, has no recoil. Inside at night, it's not very loud, so she's not going to blow her ears out doing it. You could even, if you have someone who's very untrained and is very skittish, you could have the weapon loaded, empty chamber, safety off, and you could just tell them, hey, anytime you grab that, you just pull back on this, and then you point and you start going to work. And it could be reasonably effective. The 22, believe it or not, it has a very respectable record of incapacitation in shootings that it's involved in. A lot of that, is obviously psychological related stops, but it's not the pussyfooting around cartridge and weapon that it gets made out to be a lot of times. So I just thought those would be some interesting, kind of additional things for you guys maybe to consider, maybe that you hadn't considered when it comes to the selection of ammunition, particularly carry and duty, ammunition, just things to keep in mind. Again, I'm not saying that switching from 38 to 22 mag is the correct answer, but there's reasons behind it for me. I'm not saying that giving someone a Ruger 1022 is the single best home defense weapon they can get, but it's certainly a choice that comes with an awful lot of upsides, very few downsides for somebody who may have some physical or other reason that they're not able to carry, a typical, handgun or something like that. But that's all I got for tonight, guys. But remember, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.